I'm here to talk about stochastic modeling of the Asian Longhorned Beetle invasion. I am a postdoc working with Dr. Keisha Cook in the math department, but I'm also working with Dr. Dave Coyle in the forestry department. I actually got my PhD in entomology, so I'm approaching math from a more applied perspective. And to sort of bring you along with me, here's a little introduction to entomology. This is the Asian Longhorned Beetle. It is an invasive pest of trees in the US, and it's native to Eastern Asia. Within the US, this was first discovered in New York City in 1996, but it's since spread up and down the East Coast. It's often transported through lumber or wooden pallets. And it's now found in Massachusetts, Ohio, South Carolina, New Jersey, and a few other places as well. These beetles can reproduce very quickly. Females can oviposit 30 to 70 eggs in their lifetime, and they'll do this by ovipositing in little egg niches. So the female will crawl up the tree a bit, bore a little divot into the tree, lay an egg there, and then climb up the tree some more, rinse and repeat that cycle. When the eggs hatch, the larvae will bore into the tree and feed on the phloem of the tree. They'll continue feeding until they pupate and then later emerge as adults. Development can take over a year. In South Carolina, it takes about a year. Farther north, it can take as long as 2.5 years. And during this time, the larva is feeding on the phloem, boring deeper into the tree. And often trees become so heavily infested with larvae that the damage is enough to kill the tree. The USDA estimates that if Asian longhorn beetle spread is unmanaged, it could kill up to over 30% of all urban trees in the US, causing about $669 billion worth of damage. Asian longhorn beetle also presents a safety hazard, as the tops of dead trees can break off and fall. This can block roadways, damage infrastructure, or harm passersby. And so management of this beetle is immensely important. To that end, the USDA, in collaboration with a number of other institutions, surveys sites where the beetle is thought to be present, and they'll scout for damage or signs of the beetle. These hosts are primarily maple trees. So damage can be a few different things. It can be those egg niches. If you look at the image on the left there, you can see the small divots where the female bored places to oviposit. This can also be areas that weep sap. If you look at the image on the right, you can see where the larvae have bored in and sap is leaking out and stains the bark of the tree. If a larvae eats enough of the phloem, the bark can dry out in that area and start to crack in on itself. And so surveyors can also note that as damage from Asian longhorn beetle. And it can also be these large exit holes here. When a beetle finishes its development, the adults emerge, leaving a large exit hole, which is about the width of a pencil. A hole that's a bit smaller could be an entrance hole where the larvae bored in, but it could also just be a hole left by something else. Once an infestation is identified, these trees are marked for removal. And eventually the trees are removed and put through a wood chipper that chops them down into small enough pieces to ensure that the beetle can survive inside those little wood chips. But what if we don't want to be chasing down this beetle forever? It's important to get ahead of it and prevent its spread. And so while these trees are being scouted, surveyors are also recording data about these trees, including their coordinates, their infestation level, and tree diameter. This information can be used to model the beetle's spread. For instance, in the Asian longhorn beetle risk model, uses this data to estimate beetle dispersal rates. This model has a few different rules, including one, that infestation intensity indicates infestation age, two, that a beetle arrives from the closest tree with an older infestation, and three, a tree is only infested once. We know some of these aren't true and some of these are not quite true, but still this early model gives us some interesting outputs, including dispersal distances and directions of the beetle. It gives us the risk of an infected tree being found within a hectare of area. And it can also rank these hectares by risk and produce some interesting dispersal images like this one. There's also an Asian longhorned beetle spread simulation that simulates the spread of infested trees. This combines a few different terms to look at the probability of a tree becoming infested. This uses a distance term, which is the distance from an infested tree to its nearest maple neighbor, uses a density term, which is the number of nearby maple trees, a diameter at breast height term, the size of the tree, a source pressure term, and mu, which is the upper limit of infestation probability. It then multiplies all of these to create a probability of a tree being infested, and can produce some interesting models like seen on the image on the right. But we'd like to build upon these starting blocks with our following objective, which is to simulate the spread of Asian longhorned beetle populations through spatial stochastic models. And this image here is the infested trees in Massachusetts on a GIS plane on the left, and then on an XY plane on the right. We're going to explore this objective through a few different research goals. The first is to identify what is the distribution of infested trees across geographic regions. 2, how does the distribution of infested trees change over time? And 3, can we predict the spread of infestations into the future? Our first step towards this was to examine how our data was spread. One tool we used for this was the Clark-Evans test. I won't go into too much detail about what this tells us or how this works, but this is an indicator that our data are pretty heavily clustered. Another indicator that our data are clustered, that these infested trees are clustered, is the Ripley's K test, which takes the number of points K of R within a specified distance of R. And we can look at that line. If the trees were homogeneously distributed, we would see a slow and steady rise in the number of infested trees as our distance R increases. But we see a much sharper and more erratic climb, indicating that infested trees are clustered. We can also look at the kernel density estimates of these infested trees across the x-coordinate, our y-coordinate, and then combining the two on the xy plane. And all of this is to say that our data is non-homogeneous. And so if we want to examine this data spatially, we need to use a non-homogeneous spatial Poisson process. This is characterized by an intensity function, lambda, where lambda is greater than 0 and specifies the number of events at a location. Additionally, the number of points in a subregion follows a Poisson distribution around that lambda. And the likelihood of the intensity function is the probability of our data given a parameter for intensity. To give a brief example of what I'm going to be showing you later, here's a toy model of our process. So we first divide the space into subgrids. And then for each subgrid, we assume that there is a constant intensity function, lambda. And here in this example, lambda can be between 0 and 20. And then we simulate a number of points in each subregion around that lambda following a Poisson distribution. You can see that in the image on the right. That's not exactly the same as the image on the left, but it's pretty similar. And then we can uniformly spatially distribute these points within each subgrid, and then add a sufficient amount of error so that to make it look a bit more natural. So how do we get lambda in the first place, though? We did this using an algorithm by Gung et al., which first divides the data into subgrids, assuming a constant intensity for each subgrid. Each probability distribution is defined by block size. And then the algorithm tests for all possible clusterings, producing a number of different lambdas. These lambdas are then tested against the data using a Markov chain Monte Carlo. And then finally, the algorithm outputs the best fit lambdas for each subregion. Here's a brief look at that algorithm. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but in case you're interested. So these are the heat maps of the inferred lambda values in our Massachusetts data. For Massachusetts in 2008, the first year of the survey on the left, and then for all the Massachusetts data points across the entire survey on the right. We also have the intensity of those infested trees for the first year of the New York survey, and then all years of the New York survey. And then pretty recent start of the South Carolina data on the left, and then all our South Carolina data so far on the right. And so here are our simulated points based on those inferred lambda. On the left is our simulated, and then on the right here, we have the real data. You can see that it's pretty close. Not exactly, though. Still got some work to do there. We also have the simulated points for each year. Each of these images is a different year of the survey, of showing all the infested trees, all our simulated infested trees based on those lambdas. In the top right, you can see the lambda heat map. And then on the bottom right, we have the violin plots showing the distribution of lambdas for each subgrid across the years. We have this same information for the New York data. New York across time. South Carolina. And then the simulated infested trees in South Carolina across time. So with this, we've managed to simulate the Asian Longhorned Beetle infestation data, but we can't easily use this to predict the future spread of Asian Longhorned Beetle. To that end, we've started using an agent-based model, which simulates interactions between individual agents who observe the emergent behaviors of a system. In this case, our agents are trees. We have these green dots to represent uninfested trees, these yellow dots to represent high-risk trees, which are uninfested trees that are nearby infested trees. These red dots, which represent infested trees that have not yet been detected by the surveyors, and purple dots to represent infested trees that have been detected by surveyors. And for each of these types of agents, we need to define their behaviors. We need to know the probability of an uninfested tree becoming infested, probability of an uninfested tree becoming high risk, the probability of a high-risk tree becoming infested, the probability of a high-risk tree being removed, the probability of an infested tree becoming detected, and then finally, the probability of a detected infested tree being removed. So we've spent most of our time on this first behavior. It's probably one of the more important ones. To begin, we can look back at that Asian Longhorned Beetle spread simulation I showed earlier. We're going to kind of use this as a baseline to get started. So while this has a distance term, a density term, diameter at breast height term, we're actually going to try and create some of those of our own. To create that distance term, we're using paired correlation functions, or PCFs. These look at the density of one object around another at varying distances r. Here on the left, we have the number of uninfested trees around infested trees. And on the right, we have the number of infested trees around other infested trees. We've also calculated the number of infested trees around uninfested trees and the number of uninfested trees around other uninfested trees. The two most important PCFs for our purposes here are the infested trees around infested trees and the uninfested trees around infested trees. Using these two PCFs, we can convert them into probability density functions, or PDFs, and then look at an uninfested tree within our agent-based model. We then look at the distance from that uninfested tree to the nearest infested tree and put that distance into our PDFs. We can then use this to look at the probability that our tree should be infested given this distance and subtract that from the probability that our tree should be uninfested at this distance to give us this distance term. This distance term can be multiplied with other terms to further inform the probability of an uninfested tree becoming infested. Another one of these terms that we're working on is the source pressure term. This term looks at an uninfested tree. And then next, it looks at all the infested trees in its subregion and all neighboring subregions. Then for each infested tree that's identified through that process, it takes the lambda of that tree's subregion and divides it by that infested tree's distance from our focal uninfested tree, giving us a source pressure score when we sum them all up. This source pressure score is then going to be adjusted for tree density and then transformed into a probability that we can multiply with our distance term and also add that to a diameter at breast height term, which we're currently working on. We're still deciding on the best method for implementing diameter at breast height into this probability. But one possibility on the left applies a logistic regression based on the survey data. Another would divide the diameters into bins, like in the figure on the right, and examine the probability of being infested that way, and then multiplying that result with our other terms to define our chances of an uninfested tree becoming infested. But what about the probability of a high-risk tree becoming infested? Well, practically, a high-risk tree is an uninfested tree, so this behavior will follow the same definitions I just described. The methods for turning yellow to red are identical to the methods for turning green to red. How does an uninfested tree become high risk? Well, this will be more clearly defined as we discuss it with the surveyors that actually conduct this process. But for the time being, our definition is that an uninfested tree in the same subregion as a detected infested tree is a high-risk tree. And so it's dependent on the purple trees around it. Next is the probability of an infested tree to become a detected tree, a detected infested tree. This is something else that we're going to be discussing with surveyors that are actually doing this work. But this can be influenced by a number of different things. The probability of that area being surveyed, the probability of being detected during that survey. This is kind of a loose number that I've heard thrown around, but I've heard that when a ground survey is conducted, when people go to the site and actually look at the trees, there's about a 30% chance of an infested tree being found. But when they do an aerial survey, it's about a 70% chance. I'll have to actually talk with the surveyors about those numbers, see if we can actually use those. But that's a rough estimate to begin with. And finally, there are budget limitations, which determine how much surveying can actually be done in the first place. Along a similar line, last piece is the probability of high-risk trees and detected infested trees being removed. This also is subject to budgetary limitations. And this is something that we're going to have to talk more with our surveyors about. Particularly their priorities when removing trees. What determines what removal efforts are what determines where removal efforts are placed? Are infested trees and high-risk trees removed together in a single area? Or do they prioritize individual infested trees before addressing high-risk trees? And so to wrap things up, this work will help manage the spread of Asian longhorned beetle by identifying high-risk areas where it could be and predicting the rate of spread of Asian longhorned beetle. We'll continue to improve our agent-based model as we infer more parameters from the data and discuss them with our collaborators. And we'll continue to add more information to this, including information about the surveys, procedures, and limitations, aspects of the landscape, and like urbanization and tree density, and how those affect the chances of becoming infested, and things like beetle behavior, the beetle's host preference, and its locomotive abilities. Thank you for your time. This work was supported and done in collaboration with the USDA. I'd like to thank Drs. Keisha Cook and Dave Coyle for their support and expertise, as well as Sam Klaus, a master's student in the department, who's been a great help in building the agent-based model. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah. And let me say before we have questions that I at least implicitly misintroduced Ethan by my own mistake. He is actually a postdoc here doing this work. So that might give you some perspective on where you might want to direct your questions. Any questions?
So this might be a little bit broad, not necessarily related to the topic, but I was wondering, what was the experience of getting a PhD in etymology?
Oh, it was pretty interesting. I think it varies from person to person. My experience was pretty nice compared to a lot of other people's, I think. I did my PhD research on stored products, things like rice you might see in big silos and stuff like that, and pest management within those systems. So a lot of my stuff was lab work, which is less intense than a lot of other entomologists, which might do field work. But yeah, it was interesting. I'm really coming to all of this from biology. So it's the math experience that's totally new to me. Hope that answers your question adequately. I'm not really sure.
I think it does.
See, math has its tendrils everywhere.
Yeah, it does.
Other questions? Oh, let's think about Doherty again. Okay, for the next installment, we have, let me see if I can get this. Get this thing up here. I guess, yeah, so Zoom can. Oh, I guess we do need this, right? Yeah, just to record. Let's get yours. So I'll let you kind of get this organized however you like. Slide.
By doing this or doing
Enable editing maybe. So it doesn't behave all badly on you. A lot of things on the pages. You want to make that what's it, full screen or something?
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's see. There's part of you up here, right?
And might go to slide.
Outlines, where's the full screen? Oh, my glasses. This one? Oh, there we go. Oh, can you take it back? All right, great.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marc Sussman. I am a senior math major. This past summer, I interned at a company called SMX. They are a DoD contractor for cyber operations and security work. So a lot of the stuff I did, I'm not allowed to talk about, but I took the main idea of the stuff that I worked on and put it into this PowerPoint to present for you guys here today. The background of this is cybersecurity is a ever-changing field and it evolves very rapidly. So we need to be able to develop technologies and tools that can evolve at the same pace or faster than it so that we can keep up with it. We decided to use this to implement this by using language models in an attempt to have the predictive side in a much easier way. The main attacks we were going for were phishing attacks. There are a couple of varieties of phishing attacks I've listed here as well that this tool could help protect against. But the main idea is we're working with URLs and we're trying to analyze URLs in an easy way and a very quick way. So we did this by using language models. We wanted to develop a heuristic tool that could increase situational awareness and be able to provide training for employees that while they were working for a company that does a lot of stuff in the cyber realm, that's not their job and they don't have very much training in that at all. So we did this because we selected a language model, we developed prompts in it. We assessed the fidelity tool and analyzed feasibility of process in order to make it simpler. And then we assessed efficiency because speed is the most important thing in this tool that we're designing here. So again, primary goal is to develop a tool that can be used for both situational awareness and training and help prevent any sort of attack at all. We want to enhance efficiency, improve training of all employees no matter what their MOS or job is. And to do this by utilizing open source resources so that we can cut costs for this tool and make it very cheap and easy to provide its service. Limitations that we're struck with, again, we struggle with real-time threat detection. A lot of cybersecurity risk comes from the downtime between when your system gets compromised and when you actually discover it and are able to purge it from the system. So this tool is hoping to eliminate that downtime completely, but at the very least, just shorten it as much as possible. Because the longer it's down for, the more financial losses and disruptions that you have in your operations that you may be completely unaware of. Brief background on language models. They're advanced AI systems capable of understanding and generating human-like text. We ended up having to decide between a couple and narrowed it down. But the main idea is by using a language model, it can react and think much faster than a person can in a scenario so that it can help prevent the breach faster and analyze stuff more quickly without needing a human to come in and analyze the situation. So again, we had to select an appropriate one. The major two that we ended up coming down to were ChatGPT 4 and BERT. I'll go into those a little bit later and why those were our last two and why we ended up selecting the one that we did. And then we had to develop prompts for the one that we chose so that it could be effective and efficient. We used Fidelity tool by analyzing a lot of case studies and seeing what has worked and what has not worked. And then again, our efficiency so that we can keep this operating as quickly as possible. Here I just have a graphic of the NIST CVE database because we use that a lot. NIST is the National Institution of Security Technologies. And we used a lot of I did a lot of research into them, into utilizing some stuff that they have on open source models and things like that. And then on the right side, it's just a general methodology of how we started and everything we went through to get to the end. So ultimately, we decided on a heuristic tool. We used a web-based platform for URL analysis. So on the right side there is kind of what it looked like when you open up the website originally. We used API keys to make it more secure, both for the user and for the company as a whole. And then ultimately, it predicts, the output is just predictive analysis of whether URLs are going to be safe or not, and whether you should click on them or should not click on them. So the way it would work is a user can paste any URL that they have, whether it's sent to them in an email or they find it on a website that they're doing research on. No matter what the URL is, just by pasting it into this tool, it can use language models and use AI to determine whether it's safe or not and whether it could pose any sort of vulnerability to the company. And we do that using the language model's predictive algorithms, which I'll go more in later into how we train them. So ultimately, the tool would ask for a password to access the API. Although if it were established on the company computers beforehand, you can skip that step and it can just be accessible because you will be on the company's servers, which they already know are secure. But in order to access it from outside of the actual company facility, you can use API keys that will be given, so that you can still access it even if you're working from home or working from another source. We used this thing displayed on the right is a 3x3 board taken from the NIST database, and it updates every 5 minutes. And it just displays a random cybersecurity vulnerability that happened in the past, just to increase situational awareness, that's taken directly from the NIST database. And if you click on any of those, it takes you into more detail on what actually happened. But it's kind of hard to tell on this, but it's just a kind of, it shows the risk of it. It shows just a brief paragraph or so on what happened, how to prevent it. And then it shows the resources at the end. This part of the tool was just for situational awareness for all users of if something catches their eye or they're like, that sounds familiar or anything like that, they can click on it to have just a more in-depth summary of what to avoid and what to look out for when you're online. So the data flow, the data is collected mostly from the NIST database, and then also included with the user inputs. The data cleans and prepares the module cleans and prepares the data for analysis. So it's given the URL, it parses through it, and it determines anything that it can find in the URL that's suspicious and to highlight, and then it will go do research on its own to test and see if it's actually correct, if there's anything wrong with there. And this is all done using algorithms and data processing that's in the language model. For the front end side of it, we used JavaScript just to create the actual website itself, since that was the easiest way to do it. And since Next.js has a lot of features and made that whole part of the thing easier, and it's able to use TypeScript as well, so that we can have the applications work across multiple platforms and devices. All right, so now into the actual language models. Quick background on ChatGPT. The main purpose of ChatGPT was to be able to actually talk to users and to be a chatbot. So it can understand text input and it responds with relevant output, as opposed to BERT, which is the other one we analyzed. And BERT, the way BERT works is it's bidirectional, so it reads all input both forward and backwards. And this allows for it to be much better at determining the context of what is asked of it, since it's able to get context from both sides before deciding, whereas ChatGPT just reads it forward and it doesn't really backtrack upon itself as it's reading the data. So, and pros and cons of both of them. Since BERT is amazing at understanding context, it's very good at taking large, like paragraphs of data and being able to fully understand everything that's in there. However, it's not really as good at generating text, and it requires a lot more fine tuning to actually get it to focus on what you're looking for to come out of it. Whereas ChatGPT is much better at actually generating text and generating responses. And it's much more versatile, even though it does struggle a little bit more with understanding the context. However, since for this project, we're really only inputting URLs and stuff like that, we don't need the context as much. We're just generally looking at, take this URL, analyze it. So we ended up deciding to use ChatGPT for this project. There's a lot of tools that we used. The main things that were required of us were it needed to be robust and it needed to be adaptable so that they could put it in a variety of different situations and it could still work. And it also had to be secure, since they work with a lot of classified and secret information. Everything had to be up to code on that, which provided a few challenges, since Next.js was not the easiest thing to work with when we were trying to create it as structured as possible. Here's a lot of the security elements that were inputted into it. At the top, there's a graphic. If you don't really understand how an API works, that's kind of just a general idea of what an API does. We ended up using 2 different APIs in the construction of this, just to add security and to make sure that there were no errors. And since we were going to have employees that were not well trained in cyber using this, it needed to be slightly foolproof so that there wouldn't be an accidental misinput or anything like that. And we needed to clean the text that they inputted to make sure there was no injection sort of attack that you could commit on it. This is just a couple of images of how it actually looks. On the left side, once you enter the API key, it then goes to the next one where you can just enter the URL. And then on the right side is the CVE board that I was talking about earlier. Here's a couple of examples that we had where the tool can just immediately output as soon as you click enter. It will analyze it, and within a second, it will output whether the link's valid, whether it's suspicious, not suspicious, just so that you can kind of eliminate the, hey, I'm going to report to HR that this email looks specific. You can take control of it by yourself and avoid having to go to somebody else and avoid the long process of dealing with other people to come fix your problems. Another thing about the security features, we have a password and that's generated as an API key for if you're off of the campus of the actual company trying to work on it. It provides we have a lot of security measures, as I mentioned, against the injection attacks. And then, of course, it complies with all relevant cybersecurity standards and regulations, which was a big thing, because we were trying to build this so that it could be immediately implemented for the company. So a lot of research into what United States standards are for website regulations. All right, then the interface itself is just in the website. That's super easy and simple. So you don't have to have training. It kind of just be, you show up on your day of work and they're like, hey, here's this new website that we have to help us out. And everybody can just understand it instantly without having to go through a whole training process of, hey, this is how it works, this is what to do. And then obviously we also are trying to increase situational awareness. So we have the CVE board in the actual website to help with that as well. This is a little bit about what they could use it for in the future. One idea we had was we wanted them to embed it into their email system so that every single email in and out gets scanned of all URLs that are contained in the email automatically so that you don't have to actually use the website at all. It could just be ingrained into the actual system, which would help reduce phishing attacks because before the employee even reads the email in that situation, there could be a flag that says, hey, we have a suspicious URL, or this email is completely clear, don't worry about it, which would again increase response time and improve threat mitigation. A few other improvements we could do was by continuously updating the language model with the NIST database, it would keep it up with all emerging threats and all stuff that is found after the date of completing this project. Also, if we find other data sources like the NIST data source to have additional data, we could implement those as well so they could pull from multiple sources to be a more complete software. You could also, they have a lot of other cybersecurity platforms that they use and they have implemented already. And a potential combination with any of those would just increase the variety of things that it's able to detect. Again, increase implementation into the business case. There's a lot of things that it would be able to do with being able to train it and being able to increase situational awareness. However, most important thing is cost effectiveness for something like this. So the way that ChatGPT pricing works is it's based off of the number of tokens that it uses. And tokens are compared to words slightly. It kind of just generates tokens based on the number of words you implement. And as you can see, the cost for tokens seems really low. However, if you were to implement it where it would read every single email coming in and out, that could start to add up. And that could end up being something that you'd have to consider if it's actually worth it to implement or not. However, if you were to implement it, there are a lot of results that you can instantly see where it would improve the workspace. And namely, just data security and ensuring that operational security continues and you don't have interruptions. But it also helps employee protection and employee morale, just with the idea that they know there are safeguards in place to protect them. And then some more long-term results. Financial security is going to be the biggest one because any downtime in operations is immediately hurting your financial security and immediately costing you money. So by ensuring that you can keep your business up and running you're protecting your future financial security and building customer relations and company image as somebody that they can trust. For SMX specifically, as I said, they wanted it to be very robust so that they could adapt it, and then they wanted it to be, and then they're very good at tailoring their solutions to their clients and whatever they specifically need. So we needed this to be able to adapt and be able to do those as well. So we made our code very robust so that it can adapt and that it can be used in a variety of different ways. And that it can also be given to companies that don't have a lot of cyber training, so that it can help them with their threat detection in a situation where they might not have much more expensive tools to be able to do it. All right, any questions on that?
Questions? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. First time hearing about this idea of using AI to get in front of phishing attacks.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then if, but it sounds like there are a lot of constraints in like making this and working with it, but is there like a vision for somehow integrating this into email systems themselves, like getting it closer to just, I don't know, ordinary?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, the most important thing is cost effectiveness, right? How much is it going to cost us? So with the way that it's built now and the way that these language models work, it's probably not practical to have it in any sort of civilian setting. But for larger businesses or companies that feel like they need a much more advanced cybersecurity field than a lot of others, it is a very practical idea because while it does cost stuff, it doesn't really cost that much for them. And they have a massive budget anyway for cybersecurity defense and training. And by implementing this, you can cut down on the training costs because your employees no longer need to worry about all of these phishing attacks. And as I said, there are a bunch of other attacks that it covers as well. But it just really gives that baseline of security without even having to think about it. It's just running in the background so that you don't have to be aware of it and constantly on your toes.
Others?
Anything else?
Were there any false positives with like the URL identification stuff? I
Yeah,
know
so,
here- Well, I know like here at the school, like they block any domain ending in like .xyz, for example, even though a lot of those are like completely valid.
yeah, so that's where we use the NIST database a lot, because we ran everything that we tested through NIST first and then through other predictive algorithms. So it does, there are situations where it can fall subject to URL masking and stuff like that. However, we had very few false positives of stuff that were actually trusted websites, because NIST does a great job of making sure that everything is exposed and very clear of what is good and what is not. So yes, but also not completely. Anything else?
I have another question now, so, do you know, are there any, like, I don't know, counterattacks, or there's something that you're trying to also, something, I guess I'm wondering, like, people have thought of this and are already thinking about how
Yeah,
to
is there a way to
how
beat it,
go
basically?
against it, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As I'm sure most of you know, the most vulnerable part of any security system is humans. So our main goal in doing this was to eliminate that as much as possible. However, there are some issues, as I mentioned, URL masking. So if you're able to mask the URL well enough, there is a chance it could get past that. That is something that with more training and more data sources that are being input into the language model, as I mentioned, like we're just using this now. If we're able to find other data sources and have it read from those as well, it will do a better job at preventing that type of thing. But as it stands right now, it is a little bit weak to URL masking, although that's not really the main thing we're looking for. We're kind of just looking at phishing attacks. So it does it what it's meant for now, but there are some vulnerabilities, yes. Anything else?
Others? Okay, let's think, Mark. Yeah. All right, well, tomorrow it's math in. It's from 10 to 5. You know, you can come and get math help. Most of you might want to come and get math help. Even if you've never done this before, you could be quite useful, more than you think. So hope to see y'all there. Otherwise, y'all have a great finals week, a great break, and we'll see you in the spring.
Thank you all for having me. Have a good one.
Thanks, Ethan.
Oh, no, I can't imagine how that.